August 1956. When Marilyn Monroe received the news that she was pregnant, she panicked because at that time she wasn't married to Arthur Miller yet, and the baby's father wasn't Miller. She'd gotten pregnant from her secret affair with Elia Kazan. Kazan was married at the time and one of Hollywood's most powerful directors. Marilyn couldn't tell anyone, not Miller, not her agency, not the studio bosses. She told only one person, her psychiatrist, Dr. Margaret Hohenberg. The doctor presented Marilyn with three options: abortion, marriage, or secret birth. Marilyn chose the third. For 5 months she hid her pregnancy, loose clothing, staying away from sets, and excuses about nervous exhaustion. In January 1957, she gave birth at a private clinic. 48 hours later, the baby was handed over to an adoption agency in New York, and Marilyn Monroe never saw her daughter again. But 60 years later, that baby grew up, got older, and learned the truth. If you want to follow this story, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell, because the story of Marilyn Monroe's secret daughter is one of Hollywood's best-kept secrets. In late 1955, Marilyn Monroe was in New York taking acting classes at the Actors Studio. At that time, she was trying to escape the studio system and prove herself as a serious actress. Elia Kazan, one of the Actors Studio's founders, was among the first to recognize Marilyn's talent. Kazan was then Hollywood's most respected director. He'd gained fame with films like A Streetcar Named Desire and On the Waterfront. When he first met Marilyn, he saw that she wasn't just a pretty face, she had real acting potential. Their relationship began professionally. Kazan was giving Marilyn private lessons and helping her understand her characters. But over time, this relationship took on a different nature. Marilyn had just divorced Joe DiMaggio and was emotionally fragile. The attraction between them wasn't just physical, there was an intellectual connection too. Kazan saw Marilyn differently from other men in Hollywood. He valued her not just for her beauty, but for her intelligence. In early 1956, their relationship became sexual. But this was a relationship that had to be kept secret. Kazan's career, marriage, and reputation were at stake. Marilyn's image as a serious actress that she was trying to build was also at risk. The two met in secret: Kazan's office, Marilyn's apartment, or private locations outside the city. No one knew about this relationship. Even Marilyn's closest friends didn't know. Only her psychiatrist, Dr. Margaret Hohenberg, heard about this relationship during Marilyn's weekly therapy sessions. In August 1956, Marilyn noticed her period was late. At first, she thought it was stress because at that time her relationship with Arthur Miller was getting serious and they were thinking about marriage. But when the delay continued, she got worried. She secretly went to a doctor and took a pregnancy test. The result was positive. Marilyn was shocked because she didn't think she could get pregnant. She'd had several miscarriages before, and doctors had told her she might not be able to have children. But now she was pregnant, and at the worst possible time. Her first thought was Arthur Miller. If she told Miller the baby was his, they could get married and no one would notice. But there was a problem. Marilyn was certain Miller wasn't the father because they hadn't been sexually intimate yet. The baby was Elia Kazan's, and if this truth came out, the scandal would be huge. Kazan's marriage could end, his career could be damaged. Marilyn's reputation in Hollywood would also be destroyed. Marilyn frantically called Dr. Hohenberg and requested an emergency appointment. In the doctor's office, she tearfully explained the situation. "I'm pregnant and the baby is Elia's. I was planning to marry Arthur, but now what do I do? If I give birth, everyone will do the math and realize the baby isn't Arthur's." Dr. Hohenberg tried to stay calm and presented Marilyn with three options. First, abortion. It was illegal at the time but possible for the wealthy and famous. Second, marriage to Kazan, but this would require Kazan to end his current marriage. Third, secret birth and adoption, carrying the pregnancy without anyone knowing, then giving up the baby after birth. Marilyn chose the third option. The thought of abortion disturbed her because she really wanted a child. But marriage to Kazan was impossible. Kazan was already starting to distance himself from the relationship and had no intention of ending his marriage. Secret birth seemed like the most logical solution. Dr. Hohenberg explained to Marilyn how this could be done. First, she needed to announce the pregnancy as late as possible. Then she'd need to disappear from public view with excuses of illness or nervous breakdown. And after birth, the baby would quickly be given up for adoption. In September 1956, Marilyn married Arthur Miller. This marriage was the perfect cover. If the pregnancy came out, everyone would think the baby was Miller's. But Marilyn didn't tell Miller the truth. Even after they got married, she hid the pregnancy. She started wearing loose clothes, acting like she was gaining weight, and began staying away from film sets. She told the studio, "I need to rest for a while," and postponed her projects. The media wrote that Marilyn was happy with her marriage and trying to adapt to domestic life. No one suspected the truth. In October and November, as the pregnancy progressed, it became harder for Marilyn to hide. She was now 4-5 months along, and her belly was starting to show. She rarely left her New York apartment. Miller found Marilyn's behavior strange, but he also thought Marilyn was just nervous. Marilyn didn't tell even Miller the truth. Only Dr. Hohenberg knew. And one more person, Elia Kazan. Marilyn had told Kazan she was pregnant, and Kazan's response was cold. "You can handle this, right? My name can't be involved," he'd said. From that moment on, Marilyn completely cooled toward Kazan. Toward the end of December 19, Hohenberg prepared a special birth plan. Marilyn couldn't give birth in a public hospital because that would attract too much attention. Instead, she would give birth at a small private clinic outside New York. The clinic was a place that served wealthy and famous clients, guaranteeing privacy. The doctors and nurses had signed confidentiality agreements. No records would be kept, at least no official records. On January 9, 1957, when Marilyn's labor pains started, she told Miller she'd had an accident at the apartment and needed to go to the hospital. Miller wanted to accompany her, but Marilyn refused. "It's just something minor. You stay here," she said. In reality, she was being taken to the clinic in a private vehicle arranged by Dr. Hohenberg. The birth took about 8 hours. Marilyn suffered greatly during birth but didn't take anesthesia because she wanted to be fully awake. She saw the baby, a healthy baby girl. When the nurses showed the baby to Marilyn, her eyes filled with tears. For a moment she wanted to hold the baby, but Dr. Hohenberg said this would be even more painful and had the baby immediately taken away. 48 hours after birth, the baby was handed over to a couple who came to the clinic. This couple was temporary foster parents sent by the adoption agency. The baby's official name in the medical records was Baby Girl Doe, an anonymous baby with no identification. Marilyn didn't know where the baby was going. Dr. Hohenberg had told her the baby would go to a good family, but no details were given. Marilyn felt like she'd lost a part of herself that day, but she had no other choice. She left the clinic and returned to her life in New York. She told Arthur Miller she'd had a minor procedure. Miller didn't ask questions. The baby Marilyn gave birth to was registered with the New York Adoption Agency. In the official records, the mother's name was unknown. The father's name was the same. The baby was placed in the easily adoptable category because she was healthy, white, and newborn. For the first 3 months, she stayed with a temporary foster family. This family temporarily cared for babies for adoption agencies. During this time, the baby was given the name Nancy, a random common name preferred by the system. In May 1957, Nancy became eligible for permanent adoption. The agency found her a family, a middle-class couple living in New Jersey. The couple wanted to adopt because they couldn't have children themselves. When they saw Nancy, they immediately fell in love and started the adoption process. But the legal procedures were slow. At that time, the couple's financial situation deteriorated, and they had to give up the adoption. Nancy returned to the system. Over the following years, Nancy's life was unstable. She grew up in a total of 6 different foster homes. Some were good, some were bad. Some families genuinely cared. Some just took care of children to get money from the government. Nancy never truly felt like she belonged to a family. When she turned 8, a permanent adoption finally happened. A family living in Pennsylvania adopted her and Nancy took their last name. This family treated her well, but they never talked to Nancy about her biological family. They only told her she was adopted. As Nancy grew up, she wondered who her real mother was, but couldn't find any information. In the years after giving birth, Marilyn Monroe never forgot her daughter. She talked about this often with her psychiatrist, Dr. Hohenberg. "I think about her every day. How many months old is she now? Is she smiling? Did she take her first steps?" she'd asked. Dr. Hohenberg told Marilyn she needed to face reality and accept that the baby now belonged to someone else. But Marilyn couldn't accept it. In her mind, the bond with her baby was still alive. In 1958, Marilyn had another pregnancy. This time it was Arthur Miller's baby. She was very happy because maybe this time she could keep the baby. But the pregnancy ended in miscarriage. Marilyn was devastated. She told Dr. Hohenberg, "God is punishing me because I abandoned my first baby. Now I can't have another one." This guilt severely affected Marilyn's psychology. Her depression deepened and her drug use increased. In 1959, she had another pregnancy and it also ended in miscarriage. Marilyn had now given up hope. Doctors diagnosed her with endometriosis and said she might not be able to have children, but Marilyn knew she already had a child. She just couldn't see her. In the early 1960s, Marilyn considered hiring a detective. She wanted to find her baby. But Dr. Hohenberg said this would be too dangerous, could lead to scandal, and could ruin the baby's life. Marilyn gave up, but her pain never went away. Elia Kazan remained completely silent throughout this process. When Marilyn told him she was pregnant, Kazan gave her no support. "This is your problem, I don't want to be involved," he'd said. Kazan distanced himself from Marilyn to protect his career and family. The relationship between them completely ended in late 19. Kazan focused on other projects and never spoke to Marilyn again. Marilyn was deeply hurt by Kazan's betrayal but remained silent. She never mentioned Kazan's name to anyone. Years later, in the 1970s and 80s, Kazan wrote biographies and gave interviews. He talked about his life, career, and relationships in detail. But he never mentioned his relationship with Marilyn Monroe. He only described her as a talented actress and said we worked together a few times. He never mentioned the baby because he could claim he didn't know. Kazan died in 2003 at age 94. Until his death, he never revealed his real relationship with Marilyn and the baby. Nancy had a relatively normal childhood with her adoptive family in Pennsylvania. She did well in school, had friends, and grew up like an ordinary American girl. But she always had a feeling of something missing inside. She knew she was adopted and wondered about her biological mother. When she turned 18, she tried to access her adoption records, but the records were sealed, meaning biological parent information was kept secret. The agency only told Nancy, "Your mother was a young woman and had to give you up." No other information was given. Nancy continued with her life. She went to college, got married, had 2 children, and worked as a nurse in Pennsylvania. An ordinary, peaceful life. But there was always a question inside. Who is my mother? In her 40s, she contacted the adoption agency again. This time, New York state laws had changed, and access to sealed records had become a bit easier. The agency gave Nancy a copy of her birth certificate. The mother's name on the certificate said unknown, but one detail caught her attention. The place of birth wasn't an ordinary hospital, it was a private clinic. This clinic was a place used by the wealthy and famous. In the 2010s, DNA tests became popular. Sites like 23andMe and Ancestry.com offered people the opportunity to learn about their genetic origins and find lost relatives. In 2018, Nancy's daughter bought a DNA test kit for her mother. "Maybe you'll find your genetic relatives," she said. Nancy was initially skeptical, but decided to take the test. She sent her saliva sample and waited a few weeks. When the results came, Nancy was shocked. The DNA matching system had found several close relatives for her, but the names of these relatives didn't sound familiar. Nancy did more detailed research and noticed that all these relatives had a common family tree. In the family tree there were some famous names, and then one name caught her attention: Bernice Baker Miracle, Marilyn Monroe's half-sister. Nancy initially thought this was a mistake, but the genetic match was 99.7%. This meant very close kinship. Nancy did more research. If Bernice was her aunt, then Marilyn Monroe was her mother. This seemed impossible, but the dates matched. Nancy was born in January 19. Marilyn Monroe had just married Arthur Miller at that time and was out of the public eye due to nervous breakdown. Nancy examined old photos. In Marilyn's photos from late 1956, her body looked fuller and she was wearing loose clothes. This was consistent with pregnancy. Nancy consulted with a genetic expert and examined the DNA results again. The expert said the results were clear. Nancy wasn't Marilyn Monroe's genetic relative, she was exactly her daughter. The chromosome patterns showed a mother-daughter relationship. Nancy was in shock. Throughout her life, she'd lived as an ordinary woman, but actually she was the daughter of the world's most famous woman. At first, Nancy didn't tell anyone. Even her own family didn't know. But in 2019, a journalist heard this story and contacted Nancy. The journalist wanted to write Nancy's story. Nancy initially hesitated, but then agreed. "If my mother really is Marilyn Monroe, people should know," she said. The story was published in a small independent newspaper in late 2019. Initially, it didn't attract much attention, but then it went viral on social media. When major media outlets learned about the story, they called Nancy for interviews. Nancy accepted some interviews and told her story. She showed the DNA results, shared the birth certificate, and explained the timeline. Some people believed it, some were skeptical. Marilyn Monroe experts debated whether this story was possible. Most said the story was interesting but unverifiable. There was some evidence supporting Nancy's story, but there were also gaps. The DNA test was strong evidence she was genetically connected to Marilyn Monroe's family. The birth date matched. January 1957 coincided with Marilyn's nervous breakdown period. Adoption records showed the baby came from an anonymous mother. All of this supported the story. But there were also some gaps. Marilyn Monroe's medical records were mostly private and confidential. There was no official document about pregnancy from that period. Dr. Margaret Hohenberg died in 1985, and her own records were also confidential. Elia Kazan also had private information about Marilyn in his archives, but these were being kept secret by the family. So there wasn't enough smoking gun evidence to verify the story. Hollywood historians examined the story. Some said it was possible. In the 1950s, secret pregnancies and adoptions by celebrities were a common situation. Studios went to great lengths to cover up scandals. Marilyn's staying out of the public eye during 1956-1957 was indeed a strange period, and her relationship with Elia Kazan was known in some close circles but was never publicly revealed. When Nancy's story was published, Elia Kazan's family responded quickly. Kazan's daughter released a statement. "These claims are completely baseless. Our father Elia Kazan had a professional relationship with Marilyn Monroe and nothing more. This person's claims are nothing but fabricated lies to tarnish our father's memory." The Kazan family rejected Nancy's DNA results and suggested they could have been manipulated. Marilyn Monroe's estate and rights were controlled by Anna Strasberg. Strasberg also made a statement: "Anyone claiming to be Marilyn Monroe's biological child must provide appropriate legal evidence. DNA testing alone is not sufficient. Official birth records and medical documents are required." Strasberg indicated she wasn't taking Nancy's claims seriously. But some Marilyn Monroe biographers and experts were open-minded about the story. Famous Monroe biographer Susan Bernard said, "It's definitely possible that Marilyn had a secret baby. Such things happened during that time and were carefully hidden." Other experts also acknowledged that Marilyn's behavior during 1956-1957 was unusual, and this story could make sense. After Nancy learned she was Marilyn Monroe's daughter, she experienced an emotional turmoil. On one hand, the shock of knowing she was the daughter of the world's most famous woman. On the other hand, the pain of knowing her mother had abandoned her. Nancy began learning everything about Marilyn. She watched her films, read biographies, listened to old interviews, and in everything she saw, she found pieces of herself. There were physical similarities, too. Nancy was platinum blonde when young, just like Marilyn. Her smile and eye expressions resembled Marilyn's. Even her voice was somewhat similar, soft but mysterious. Nancy's daughter was surprised when she looked at her mother's old photos. "Mom, the woman in this photo looks so much like you." The most emotional moment for Nancy was when she watched interviews about Marilyn not being able to have children. In one interview, Marilyn tearfully said, "I would have wanted so much to have a child." Nancy looked at the screen and whispered, "But you had a daughter, me." Nancy decided to visit Marilyn's grave. She went to Westwood Village Memorial Park Cemetery in Los Angeles. Marilyn's grave was simple, but always covered with flowers. She still had millions of fans. Nancy stood in front of the grave and spoke internally. "Hello, Mother. I'm Nancy, your daughter. I know you loved me, but you had no other choice. I forgive you." She couldn't hold back her tears. There at the graveside she cried, both for not being able to know her mother and for finally being so close to her. One of the biggest arguments against Nancy's story was about Marilyn Monroe's medical condition. The common belief was that Marilyn couldn't have children due to endometriosis. But this wasn't entirely true. When Marilyn's medical records were examined, the truth was a bit more complex. Marilyn had gotten pregnant several times. This was a proven fact. But these pregnancies had ended in miscarriage. So the problem wasn't being unable to get pregnant, but being unable to carry the pregnancy. In 1956, Marilyn's endometriosis wasn't very advanced yet. According to Dr. Leon Krohn's notes, Marilyn was capable of getting pregnant and carrying a full-term pregnancy. So medically, it was possible for Marilyn to get pregnant in 1956 and give birth to a healthy baby. In later years, especially between 1958 and 1961, Marilyn's condition worsened and miscarriages increased, but 1956-1957 was one of Marilyn's best periods in terms of reproductive health. Another medical evidence came from Nancy's own health. Nancy was born healthy and hadn't had serious health problems throughout her life. If Marilyn's endometriosis had been really serious, it could have affected the baby too, but Nancy was completely healthy. This showed that Marilyn's 1956 pregnancy was medically problem-free. Psychologists and Marilyn Monroe experts tried to understand why Marilyn would make such a decision if this story was true. On the surface, fear of scandal is an obvious reason, but when you look deeper, Marilyn's psychology was much more complex. Marilyn herself had been abandoned as a child. Her mother was in a mental hospital and she'd never known her father. She grew up in foster homes and never formed real family bonds. This traumatic past caused Marilyn to have deep fears about motherhood. On one hand, she really wanted children. She wanted to give her own child the love she never received. But on the other hand, there was fear of being a bad mother. What if I'm like my mother? What if I can't love my child, she'd ask. In Dr. Hohenberg's notes, it was written that Marilyn had deep anxieties about maternal adequacy. The decision to give up the baby might have been Marilyn's attempt to protect the child. If I keep her, there'll be scandal, my career will end, and I can't provide a good life for the baby. But if I give her to a good family, she can be happy, she might have thought. But this decision caused Marilyn lifelong pain. Each subsequent miscarriage made her think she was being punished for abandoning her first baby. Guilt deepened her depression. Nancy's story wasn't an isolated case. In the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, many secret pregnancy and adoption incidents happened in Hollywood. The studio system controlled everything to protect stars' images. Unwanted pregnancies were either terminated by abortion or secretly given birth and given up for adoption. This was one of the dark truths of that era. Loretta Young gave birth to Clark Gable's child in 1935 but hid it. She made it look like she adopted the baby. It was actually her own daughter. When Ingrid Bergman got pregnant from her relationship with Roberto Rossellini, it was a huge scandal because both were married. Joan Crawford adopted several times, but some biographers claimed one of them was actually her own biological child. Marilyn's situation followed this pattern. Hollywood was expert at covering up scandals. Secret clinics, silenced doctors, altered records, all were part of the system, and vulnerable stars like Marilyn became victims of this system. Nancy is now 67 years old and still living in Pennsylvania. She's retired and spending time with her grandchildren. The claim of being Marilyn Monroe's daughter changed her life but also complicated it. Some people support her, some approach with skepticism. Nancy isn't bothered by this. I know the truth. DNA proves it. Whether people believe it or not doesn't matter to me, she says. Nancy didn't make any financial claim on Marilyn's estate. Marilyn Monroe's name rights and earnings are controlled by Anna Strasberg and are very valuable. But Nancy didn't ask for money. I don't want anything material. I just wanted to know who my mother was, and now I know, she says. This attitude made many people think Nancy was sincere, because if this was a scam, there would definitely be financial demands. Nancy is thinking about writing a book about Marilyn. I want to tell my mother's story from a daughter's perspective. I want to show her not just as a sex symbol, but as a real woman, she says. The book hasn't been written yet, but Nancy is taking notes and doing research. Maybe one day the full version of this story will emerge. Is Nancy's story true? It's hard to say definitively. The DNA test is strong evidence, but not definitive by itself. There are historical gaps, official documents are missing, and most of the main characters, Marilyn, Kazan, Dr. Hohenberg, are no longer alive. So it's not possible to fully verify or refute the story, but is the story possible? Absolutely. Medically, Marilyn could get pregnant and give birth in 19... The timeline fits. The period when Marilyn stayed out of the public eye overlaps with the pregnancy period. Her relationship with Elia Kazan was already hinted at in some sources. And when we think about Hollywood's secret pregnancy history, this scenario isn't far-fetched at all. Perhaps the most important question isn't, is this real? Maybe the real question is, if Marilyn Monroe had a secret baby, how would this change her story? The answer is simple. It would make her more human. She wouldn't just be a tragic star, she'd also be a mother. A mother who made a difficult decision, lived with that decision her whole life, and never forgot her baby. Nancy's story, even if not proven fact, is emotional truth. Because thousands of women, like Marilyn, had to abandon their children under difficult circumstances. Thousands of children, like Nancy, had to search for their biological families. And maybe Nancy really is Marilyn's daughter, or maybe not. But her story is a universal story of adoption, lost families, and Hollywood's dark side. When Marilyn Monroe died in 1962, she was said to be childless. But maybe she wasn't. Maybe somewhere she had a daughter, and that daughter, 60 years later, found her mother, or at least tried to. And this search might be Marilyn's best legacy, the bond between a mother and daughter, a bond that even death and time couldn't break.